All right, Chuck, we can see you. Take it away.
Okay, great. Now, all right. So we're going to start in the late 1970s, and we really reached a crossroads then. And in particular, we're going to focus a little bit on ExxonMobil. And the reason why everybody's getting on ExxonMobil's case these days is because back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, ExxonMobil really knew what the consequences were going to be with regard to climate change. So these are a few quotes. This is James Black, an Exxon scientist from 1978. And basically what he's saying here is that we have about a window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions. So here we are over 40 years later, and we haven't really made those hard decisions yet. And then Roger Cohen, the research director for Exxon in 1981 said, the results of our research are in good accord with the scientific consensus on the effect of increased atmospheric CO2 on climate. So Exxon had some of the very best climate scientists in the world back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the results they came up with are completely consistent with the latest results from the IPCC. And then Exxon actually put out a corporate primer on CO2 and climate change in 1982. And here's an interesting quote at the end of it. There are some potentially catastrophic events that must be considered. Once the effects are measurable, they might not be reversible. And this is absolutely true. And so with all of this information that the climate scientists came up with at ExxonMobil, what did they do with it? Well, they basically decided to spend the next few decades trying to misinform the public, trying to promote the idea that there wasn't enough information to make any strong decisions about climate change. So where does that leave us today? Well, this is from the IPCC report back in 2014. Now, it's a little bit of a complicated figure, so I'll try to explain it to you. But what we're looking at here, this figure here is having a 50% probability of not exceeding the carbon budget that will lead to these particular temperature goals. So this is if your goal is to stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees C, basically this is how much carbon you can burn in gigatons of CO2 between when this report came out, or in around 2013, 2014 to 2050, that shows in red. And then the remainder that can be burned in the second half of the century is in gray. So I'm going to go over to here, which is an 80% probability of doing the same thing. And, I don't know about you, but I kind of like having a better than 50-50 chance of having dangerous climate change. So let's go and use the 80% probability. So one of the things that's interesting here is if your target is 2 degrees, back in 2014, we had about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 that we could still burn before the end of the century. And one of the things that's really interesting is basically we've already exceeded at an 80% probability, already exceeded back in 2013, 2014, the ability to stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees. Now, this is only if we look at emissions and we don't look at negative emissions. Now, you might ask, well, what are negative emissions? And I'll get to that later. But the thing that you should get out of this figure is that we've got a carbon budget that we have to stay on track for. We're not doing a particularly great job, but at least we know what the numbers are, and we know what the potential targets are. Now, this is an interesting figure here. because what it does is it looks at the amount of sort of allowable cumulative carbon emissions versus our fossil fuel reserves. And basically what this is showing is that we can burn 886 gigatons of CO2 between now and 2050 to meet that 2-degree target that we were shooting for back then. As of 2011, we had already burned that much. So that's how much was remaining, roughly 565 gigatons for the remaining 89 years. And since we're burning roughly emitting about 50 gigatons a year, that's not a very good sign. Now, when we look at the global fossil fuel reserves, what you can see is there's a lot of coal left, and there's a fair bit of oil and gas. But the reality is that if we continued consuming fossil fuels the way we have been, we would basically go through gas and oil sometime during the next century. And we have enough reserves of coal that if we continued burning them the way we were back in 2011, it would last for several centuries. The problem that we have is if we kept moving the way we're gonna run out of fossil fuels. The problem though is we won't run out of them fast enough. And so we're kind of stuck. Now, back in 2010, some colleagues and I wrote this paper called Geoengineering, the Inescapable Truth of Getting to 350. Now, for some of you that may not have been thinking that much about this topic back in 2010, 350 was the atmospheric concentration of CO2 that we were shooting for to stabilize the temperature at 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. And that was something that NASA scientist James Hansen had come up with. And so there was a special issue of this journal called Solutions that was all about getting to 350. And what my colleagues and I did is we sort of evaluated what we needed to do to get to 350. And after we evaluated it, we basically concluded the society was only going to be able to successfully meet that goal if it not only continue with aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but we were going to actually have to supplement it with geoengineering. Now over the time, geoengineering has developed a pretty bad reputation. And what I want you to do is really kind of avoid looking at the red flags and thinking about what it's about. So geoengineering is the deliberate large-scale engineering of the Earth system to counteract the effects of greenhouse warming and ocean acidification. And there's 2 basic types of geoengineering we're going to talk about. One is solar radiation management, and that's actually altering the incoming solar radiation and thereby affecting Earth's radiation budget to cool the temperatures directly. Now that's just actually dealing with the symptoms of elevated greenhouse gases. It's not solving the problem, but it is one way to keep the temperatures cooler. The other is carbon dioxide removal, and that's extracting CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it elsewhere. And I call this a CO2 remediation approach because unlike solar radiation management, it's actually tackling the real problem, which is reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere.
Chuck, can I pause you for just a moment? We're only seeing more or less your torso and hands and not quite your face. Could you just tilt your computer camera just a little higher, and that way we can see there a little bit more, a little bit more.
That's as much as it goes.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Thank you so much. Please continue on geoengineering. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just tell you so I'm not a big fan of solar radiation management. And back when I wrote this paper 13 years ago, I was I thought, oh, we do not want to go there. But as we continue to not reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, all of a sudden, we may have to start thinking about things like this, which are highly controversial, but we actually need to be doing the research to see if it's actually something we want to at least have in the toolbox down the road. So here's what we mean by solar radiation management. One thing that we could do is we could put sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, and that would basically reflect some of the incoming solar radiation. So basically, we're dimming the skies. And another alternative is to actually inject moisture, creating artificial cloud whitening in the atmosphere. Again, if we increase the clouds, increase their whiteness, more of that incoming solar radiation will be reflected back into space. All right, so something that I have been very interested in and have been supportive of it since we wrote this paper is carbon dioxide removal. And this basically refers to extracting CO2 from the atmosphere and then storing it long-term underground. That, well, actually, it can be stored underground. It could be stored in the deep ocean. It could be stored in the terrestrial biosphere, or it can even be stored in the human-built environment. So remember, I mentioned before this idea of being carbon negative. Some of these CDR processes are considered to be carbon negative. And I'm going to talk about two very basic types here. One is called direct air capture. And basically the idea is this is a means of basically drawing vast amounts of air through mechanical systems that then scrub the CO2 from that air. It's extremely expensive because you have to remove a tremendous amount of air through it, because CO2 may be a problem in our atmosphere, but it's still incredibly dilute, right? We're at what, 440 parts per million or something around that. So it's still very dilute, very, very expensive energetically, and energy is money. So this is really still prohibitively expensive, but people are trying to figure out how to bring the cost down. Another one is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. People just typically refer to it as BECCS. And the idea here is that now you have the biosphere sucking up the CO2 from the atmosphere. So whether it's trees or other terrestrial plants, they're capturing that CO2. We harvest it, we burn the biomass, and then we capture the CO2 in that power plant, and then we basically inject it underground. So this is one way of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it into some sort of geological repository. And, like I said, there are companies out there working on direct air capture and storage. One of the American companies called Global Thermostat. One of the Canadian companies, which is actually just a few hundred miles away from us here, is Carbon Engineering. And then, when most people in the world think about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, they think about basically burning waste biomass, often corn husks and things like that, burning it at a power plant, capturing the CO2, and then injecting it underground. So those are the kind of what I consider the terrestrial solutions. These are the things that people have been focusing on for well over a decade. But in recent years, people have started to look at ocean solutions. And what I'm going to focus on initially here are the ones that I call the in situ ocean solutions. That means these happen in the ocean itself. And there was a National Academy report on ocean solutions for carbon dioxide removal that recently came out. And I'm going to just kind of go through the list of things and talk a little bit about each one. One is the electrochemical capture of CO2 from the ocean. And the idea here, it's somewhat similar to DAC in the direct air capture in the atmosphere, but we're using electrochemical means to basically pull out these ionic forms of CO2 in the ocean. And of course, the ocean and the atmosphere are in equilibrium with one another with regard to CO2. So if you can pull that, the ionic forms of CO2 out of the ocean, then that will draw the CO2 down out of the atmosphere into the ocean. Another is called ocean alkalinity enhancement. And what this basically does is you're basically adding bases, chemical bases into the ocean to balance out the CO2 to essentially help deacidify, if you will, the oceans. And again, the idea is that if you can draw that, if you can neutralize the acid, the CO2 in the ocean, then again, since it's in equilibrium with the atmosphere, you can draw down CO2 out of the atmosphere. Another one, which everybody would love to see as a great solution, would be marine ecosystem restoration. If we could bring back, for example, whale populations, if we could potentially enhance the what we call blue carbon ecosystems, seagrasses and wetlands, mangroves, things like that, they store a tremendous amount of CO2. The problem is that restoring these things, one, will take a lot of time, and two, it turns out that it's still they still have a fairly limited capacity in terms of how much CO2 they can actually remove from the Earth's climate system. Another idea is artificial upwelling. That's where you bring nutrients up to the surface to stimulate phytoplankton blooms and then have those phytoplankton blooms sink out. Big problem with that is if you bring up deep water, the deep water has nutrients, but it also has CO2 in it. You bring it up, it warms in the surface, and then that CO2 will degas. So you have to figure out whether you're really going to come out ahead if you do this artificial upwelling. Another idea is growing macroalgae or seaweed, cultivating it, and then just sinking it into the deep sea. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then one idea that's been kicking around since really the late 1980s is ocean iron fertilization. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here. So what we found out basically in the late 1980s is that there are vast areas of the ocean, particularly the subarctic Pacific, the equatorial Pacific, and the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, where iron is the limiting nutrient that limits phytoplankton blooms. And by taking samples of seawater in these ecosystems and adding iron, we knew that we could get phytoplankton to bloom. So, of course, people said, "Wow, oh, great! Maybe we can add iron to these ecosystems, create phytoplankton blooms that would then sink out, into the deep sea, that would then sink out. So these phytoplankton, they take up these inorganic forms of carbon, and again, since it's in equilibrium with the atmosphere, that draws CO2 down out of the atmosphere into the ocean. And then the phytoplankton and other non-living organic matter is basically exported into the deep sea by sinking. And ideally, it's stored there for centuries. People are still excited about that particular approach, but we actually, oceanographers since the 1990s have been conducting iron fertilization experiments all throughout these ecosystems, the subarctic Pacific, the equatorial Pacific and the subantarctic part of the Southern Ocean. And quite a while ago, this paper came out talking about the science, policy, and commerce associated with ocean fertilization. And what we saw from all these experiments is the results were highly variable. We could usually stimulate a phytoplankton bloom, but whether there would be a significant export of that carbon into the deep sea, sometimes we got it and sometimes we didn't. Also, were uncertain ecological impacts, and it's hard to predict what these long-term ecological effects or impacts on the ocean might be. And some of them might occur fairly remotely from where you've actually added it. So the idea is that if you can stimulate a phytoplankton bloom, it's going to strip out the nutrients in that particular area. And then that patch of water that's been stripped of nutrients is going to be carried by the currents someplace else and that someplace else may be reliant on those nutrients. So one of the real hard things we have to do is to actually figure out what the environmental impacts are when we do this kind of experimentation and potentially introduce this kind of technology. So the other thing is when the modelers then got a hold of the results and started to sort of scale it up to the global scale, what they found out basically is that it seemed like there was too much effort for too little return. That you would have to continually add iron to vast areas of the ocean. And it turns out that it's not that expensive money-wise, but it does involve quite an effort. But we're only talking about a few percent reduction reduction in the amount of emissions happening annually. So it just doesn't add up. So basically, the verdict drawn by many oceanographers, but not all. There's still people that are arguing for this, and maybe they'll convince us one day. But I think, at least from my perspective, this is a no-go. Now, the other idea, and there's a lot of groups that are looking at this now, for seaweed cultivation and sinking. Now, there's a lot of reasons to farm seaweed in the ocean. There's a lot of great things you can do with it. You can use it in animal feeds. You can use it to feed humans. You can produce pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals. You can produce biofuels and you can produce biomaterials. So there's a lot of great things that you can do with seaweeds. I'm not convinced that one of those great things is actually growing the seaweeds and then sinking them into the deep sea. Most of where we grow seaweeds is on the continental shelves, particularly in the coastal waters. And it turns out that if we could grow seaweeds over all of the world's continental shelves, it still wouldn't add up to very much in terms of the whole carbon budget, the whole global carbon budget. So, and of course, people have other ideas about how they want to use our coastal waters besides just growing seaweeds. So in order for this to actually work and have a significant impact, we would have to basically grow those seaweeds out in the open ocean. And there's a reason why seaweeds don't grow out in the open ocean very much. There are some exceptions, things like sargassum and the Sargasso Sea. And actually, sargassum has been growing like gangbusters and washing up on beaches throughout the Caribbean over the last decade. And that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity for us to capture that. What I would recommend is harvesting it. Right now, what people do is they clean up their beaches and they burn the stuff or they bury it. And what we could do is we could actually anaerobically digest it and turn it into biogas, which would actually be quite a useful thing to do. But that's kind of the exception. There's not real great opportunities, I think, without a tremendous amount of effort to grow seaweeds in sufficient quantities in the open ocean to just sink it and help solve the climate change problem. So this kind of reinforces what I like to call MVR, monitoring, verification, and reporting. And that's one of the things that's really difficult with these in situ ocean approaches to carbon dioxide removal, because out in the open ocean, it's really difficult to do this monitoring, to actually determine what the environmental impacts are, and then certify how much of that carbon you really know is being stored. So that's what you have to really ask yourself, especially when you're working in fairly open systems like this. How can you be sure that you're actually getting rid of as much carbon as you think you are? And so that got me and a number of my colleagues, and many of them were trained as oceanographers, to start thinking about things a little bit differently. And the idea was that we were going to grow marine microalgae because there's a lot of good reasons to do that, but we're going to do it on land. And so this is actually kind of a hybrid ocean and terrestrial approach. And this paper that we just put out about a year ago on transforming the future of marine aquaculture, a circular economy approach. And basically, what we're looking at here, this is on the big island of Hawaii. This is a big microalgae farm, and this is an experimental area where we were just growing marine microalgae. So the way you grow marine microalgae, well, basically we grow them initially in these large tubes, closed tubes. This is called a photobioreactor. And what we would do is we would grow, a monoculture, a single strain of algae in these up to a fairly high concentration. And then you would use that to inoculate these raceway ponds. So we have big paddle wheels moving the water around in these raceway ponds. And they basically, we inoculate them. We let the algae grow for a couple of days and then we harvest it. If you let algae grow in these open systems for too long, then they get contaminated, and that's not good for the products you're interested in. So why are we doing this? Well, one of the things is that it really matches up with the idea of trying to do the monitoring and verification and reporting, because this is a system where you know everything that's going in and everything that's going out, unlike trying to do all of those various approaches that people are talking about doing in situ in the ocean. So as far as I'm concerned, in terms of MVR, we check the right box. All right. Now, why would you want to grow vast quantities of microalgae? Well, back in the 1970s, the federal government, Department of Energy, was very excited about producing microalgae biofuels. But one of the problems with that is that it turns out that algae are expensive to produce. They're very valuable. And you can't compete with the other liquid fuels. We found that out. And at first we were disappointed, but then we started thinking about it and realized, well, actually, the use of liquid fuels, if we're looking out, in the next few decades, they're going to drop dramatically. We're electrifying just about everything. So the only places we're likely to still be using liquid fuels, 15, 20 years from now, is in long distance aviation and long distance shipping, marine shipping. But certainly the light vehicle fleet will be electrified very quickly, and even the heavier vehicles will soon be transitioning. So we said, okay, but it turns out that we can have really big climate effects by using microalgae for food. And in fact, the climate impacts of growing microalgae for food are greater than they ever would have been for producing biofuels. So why is that the case? So currently, terrestrial agriculture is essentially the backbone of our global food production system, but its benefits come at the expense of really large negative impacts on climate, land use, fresh water, and biodiversity. So, you know, by 2050, our global food production system is going to have to grow tremendously, because we'll have to be feeding another 2 billion people, almost 10 billion people. But at the same time, we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture, as well as its use of arable land and fresh water. And this is really quite apparent when you look at the carbon footprint of agriculture. So if we look at projections to 2050, we can see in 2010, basically about a quarter of all of our greenhouse gas emissions were associated with agriculture. And to meet our needs in 2050, you know, if we increase our food production using our current agricultural system, that'll lead to another 25% increase, 3 gigatons of CO2. But at the same time, you know, if we're trying to meet the Paris goals of 1.5 degrees C or a 2-degree target, to hit the 2-degree target, we have to reduce our emissions from agriculture by 74% to 4 gigatons. If we want to hit 1.5, we have to reduce them to 0. So how are we going to do that? So in terms of environmental sustainability considerations, relative to terrestrial crops, marine microalgae typically have higher productivities by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So you can look at the biomass yields of these different things, soy, rapeseed, palm oil, et cetera, and then look at microalgae. 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. That has tremendous advantages. So for one thing, if you kind of turn that around, what that means in terms of land use is that you can produce an equivalent amount of biomass from less than 1/10 to 1/100th the land area. So, and the other thing is, because marine microalgae don't require soil and irrigation, their cultivation doesn't compete with agriculture and other stakeholders for arable land and fresh water. Yes, it does need some land, but it doesn't need to be arable. And in fact, when we look at the amount of land, the land footprint, if you will, of these other sources of food and the freshwater footprint, to look at how many hectares you need for these different sources of food. For example, beef, you have to have 12.5 hectares of land to produce a ton of beef. And you have to have over 148,000 cubic meters of water for a ton of beef. And then, you know, you can look, pork is better in terms of water, worse in terms of land footprint. Chicken's pretty good. I still eat chicken. I don't eat beef and pork anymore. Soybeans are okay. They still need a lot of water, but their land footprint is better than these meat products. But look at microalgae. You know, the land footprint is in terms of the amount to produce a ton of protein is much smaller. And same thing for, again, this is the freshwater footprint. And if you're growing marine microalgae, your freshwater footprint is pretty negligible. So what are we doing when we try to grow algae? First of all, they're photosynthetic, right? So they're going to need sunlight. They're going to need CO2. They're going to need water. And, you know, because we're more than just carbohydrates, they're going to need nutrients as well. So, you know, the sunlight, Mother Nature provides. The water, even from the seawater, they get what they need. We have to add nutrients. And importantly, in the way we're growing the algae, we have to add CO2. Now, you might say, well, why can't they just take up the CO2 from the atmosphere? And the problem is that when these microalgae are growing at optimal rates, they're growing like gangbusters, and they're taking up CO2 so rapidly that it can't diffuse through the air-water interface fast enough. And so we have to add CO2. Now, back in the day when the Department of Energy was really excited about this, well, we have all of this CO2 being put out by power plants. Why don't we just do that, right? Take up that CO2. The problem, of course, if you're interested from a climate perspective, is that if it's coming from a fossil-fired power plant, then you're just getting one more cycle out of that CO2 before it ends up in the atmosphere. And then in terms of after you harvest this microalgae, you can use it for fuels, you can use it for protein for animal feeds or to feed humans, you can use it to produce biodiesel and jet fuel. Yes, we have flown jets. The Navy has flown jets with algal biofuels. They've done a complete set of war games in using, well, a lot of their ships are nuclear powered, but all of the other ships were using algal-based fuels. And you can also produce bioplastics and other biopetroleum based products. So all of the plastics that we now see out there, we could potentially produce. You can even produce carbon fiber, which is kind of exciting. So, but we have this problem about CO2. Well, one of the interesting things to do is to think about integrating direct air capture into the system. So what you do is you basically cut out that power plant and you take one of these direct air capture systems, perhaps the one with global thermostat, and you basically capture that CO2 from the atmosphere. Some of it, in fact, more of it than you need for the algae, you can actually sequester. So you can get carbon credits for that, and then you can use the remaining CO2 for algae to help produce these other products. Now, if you're putting it into fuels or feed, then you're not going to get negative emissions, because essentially your metabolism or burning it in internal combustion engines is going to put it into the atmosphere. But if you put it into some of these other products that are long-lived, then that is actually carbon negative. And of course, to run a system like this, you need electricity, and you need to do it from renewables if you want to get things to have as low a carbon footprint as possible. Now, there's also a way to combine algae with what I referred to as BECCS before, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And here the idea is, you basically grow terrestrial biomass. And in this case, I've shown you eucalyptus, which grows abundantly, introduced a species that grows abundantly in Hawaii. You harvest it, you burn it in that power plant, but you capture the CO2, and again, you can sequester it and then use what you require to grow your algae. So that's another way of integrating algae with other carbon dioxide removal technologies. And of course, don't have to do it with just terrestrial plants. You could potentially do it with seaweed as well. So we actually went through and put out this paper in 2018 where we actually worked through the numbers to figure out how you could do algal biomass cultivation with bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. And we took an example. We said, okay, let's take an area of 2,800 hectares of soy cropland. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare what we get from that soy cropland versus an integrated ABEC system where we basically use 2,680 hectares to produce eucalyptus, so that's 96% of the area, and then just use 120 hectares, 4% of the area, to grow algae. And when you do the comparisons, basically the eucalyptus fire power plant provides the algae production facility, with the CO2 that we need, as well as the electricity. And this integrated ABEX system produces as much protein, and actually it's much more nutritious. It turns out that marine, well, microalgae in general, much more nutritious than terrestrial plants. That has essential amino acids. It has omega-3 fatty acids, lots of minerals, things that you just don't get in terrestrial plants. So it is more nutritious. And so you produce as much protein, and at the same time, you're not increasing the land or freshwater demand. You're also generating 61.5 terajoules of electricity while sequestering 29,600 tons of CO2 per year. So this is pretty cool, you know, because one of the big complaints that people have about BECCS is if you just use terrestrial plants, they need a lot of area. And that means that you're potentially taking arable land away from where you're trying to produce food. So this is one way to potentially get around that. And again, this is an example of the climate benefits that emerge from algae because they produce, you know, so much biomass from, you know, 2 orders of magnitude less land than terrestrial plants. So let's dig a little bit deeper. I'm getting close to the end here. There's a couple papers that we just had come out last year. I showed you the first one. The other one we had in PLOS Biology. The co-author in that is Selena Scott-Buechler, who was a grad student of mine. And she basically did a global analysis, you know, using GIS to figure out where we could do this and how much algae we could grow around the world. And this first figure here is just a first cut at it. And what you can see is that you want to do it basically in the area between the tropics. And what that means is basically most of this is going to happen in the global south. So where we think of, you know, North America and Eurasia as being the breadbaskets for the world, all of a sudden we may be able to introduce a new breadbasket in the global south. Oh, but now this kind of gives an impression that's not fair. You can't really grow algae, marine microalgae, in the middle of the continents and make it make sense. So what we then did is we said, okay, we have to make sure that the land is flat enough and have a lot of other things. Oh, and by the way, it shouldn't be more than 20 kilometers from the coast, because otherwise the costs of transporting seawater inland become prohibitively expensive. So what we did is we ended up putting all of these constraints on it. And what we're left with are all of these areas along the coasts of South America and Africa and Australia, New Guinea, India. Now, it doesn't look like much, right? But it turns out that even in those small strips of land around the world, we could produce all the protein that the human population will need by 2050, which I think is pretty cool. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to and that all of our food is going to come from microalgae, but it does mean that we have a really interesting opportunity to find a very new and alternative source of protein. So in terms of addressing the global challenges, the large-scale industrial cultivation of marine microalgae on shore can provide the protein necessary to feed a global population approaching 10 billion people. It can reduce terrestrial agriculture's demand for arable land and fresh water, thereby reducing the pressure for deforestation and its associated greenhouse gas emissions and terrestrial biodiversity loss. It can account for a total reduction of up to a quarter to 1/3 of the annual global CO2 emissions by 2050. It can lead to a number of innovative options for CDR, from the production of carbon negative products for the human built environment to much more sustainable algae-based approaches for CO2 utilization associated with direct air capture and BECCS. It can reduce agriculture's fertilizer runoff and the subsequent eutrophication of freshwater and marine ecosystems. And then something that is relevant to this audience I didn't talk about a whole lot is that it can contribute to the feed production for the aquaculture industry and thereby reduce its demand for fish meal. And fish meal is, currently accounts for 30% of the global wild caught fish harvest. So with marine microalgae can basically be used as an aqua feed and do things like soy can't do. Most of these aqua feeds are primarily soy, and then they add fish meal to basically bring in the nutrition that they can't get from the soy. And where did the fish get it? The fish get it through the food chain from the algae. Okay, that's all for me. And I am going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Chuck, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I found myself just leaning in, really excited about these algal solutions. There were some questions in the chat, or at least one question in the chat from Amy, and we'll come back to that. But Chuck, I just want to bring your attention to it so you could queue up a good answer, Amy, for our Q&A, which we'll do at the end. But I want to make sure that we get Paul Cereghino in here. Paul, I already introduced you, but I'd love to bring you on, and you should have the ability to bring your slide deck up. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Just a sec here. Let me figure out my buttons and my screens and my windows.
I have a phrase that I like to use, which is, I grant you grace. Let there be grace, please.
Whatever happens.
Absolutely.
All right. So looks like you're probably seeing my screen right now.
Looks good. We're up.
Now I need to see my screen right now. Okay. I think we're ready to roll.
Okay. Take it away.
Thank you. So ostensibly, I'm here to discuss local resiliency and adaptation, and in particular in the context of federal and state programs. And so there's so very much to talk about. As a federal employee and a public servant, it's pretty important for me to be clear about how I'm speaking. So tonight, you are getting Paul's professional opinion, and all the opinions expressed are purely my own and do not reflect the opinion or policy of the U.S. federal government or my agency. So I like to get it out of the way early. And in particular, you're probably going to get less, if I were speaking with my federal hat on, you'd probably get a lot of boring slides explaining each federal funding opportunity in pre-approved language. And so if you would like to have that, feel free to give me a call on the job. We can talk about funding strategies, and maybe I can point you in a useful direction. And in particular, I'm just going to pop in the chat. A lot of things come across my desk, and so this publication was put out by Derek Kilmer, Representative Kilmer's office, and provides a better summary of funding opportunities than have been provided by the federal agencies themselves. So I think there are resources there. I wanted to sort of stay out of that territory and dive into some more sort of conceptual strategy thinking. So I wanted to talk particularly about thinking about strategies for local communities and try and offer my best professional judgment on the intersection of three topics. One is climate change. And I think in the context of local community action in relationship to existing governments to empower experimentation, I think it's useful to think of climate change as one facet of a complex global ecological problem that's really rooted in cultural practices. And then the second piece is, I think it's also useful to see resilience and adaptability as a function of local infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I probably should say infrastructures, plural, because I'm thinking about social and physical infrastructures that we depend on, that make our lives possible. And then finally, I wanted to consider the potential functions of government resources and authorities as a tool within a coherent local strategy. Usually we think about state and federal authority as being something that's sort of done to us, but I think there's an opportunity for local communities to begin to develop and shape and guide, state and federal direction as well. And I'll try and explain why I think that's important. So really my interest is how shall we live here into the long future, on San Juan Islands, in Salish Sea, anywhere in particular. In fact, we all have to live somewhere, and how we live somewhere matters a great deal in terms of things like, a net carbon balance. So my focus, though, is on exploring community empowerment and increasing local experimentation in that space. So my apologies in advance for the fire hose experience. If I sort of jump around a lot, thank you for giving me a chance to experiment with you as my guinea pigs. This is an interesting new topic area for me because I've primarily worked in ecological restoration. I'm very interested in the intersection of ecosystem and ecological collapse and climate change. So I want to briefly describe what I mean when I say ecological collapse. Some people like the term, some people don't. But it's this net phenomena of ecological collapse that I'm particularly interested in, with climate change being a major contributor. I tried to simplify a very technical definition from Bland and Friends. And I also wanted to start by sort of reframing climate change as part of a pattern of global ecological degradation, leading to local ecological collapse and then culminating in global ecological collapse under climate pressures. So the important part of this definition is that in ecosystems, we find ourselves crossing over thresholds. And when ecosystems collapse, they don't just disappear, they just turn into different ecosystems. And our future ecosystem is likely to lose key features. It may lose defining ecological communities or processes, and it can often result in lower productivity, less efficient capture and cycling of resources. And then even if we find ways to regenerate, to once again become stewards of life and tend the landscapes we live in, then they become something different because they no longer have some of the underlying attributes of the historical ecosystem. So basically the short story is this is a one-way ticket and we're already on the ride. And so, that is sort of where I find myself thinking about what does it mean to be a local citizen in an ecological context, trying to figure out how to live on Earth in a way that doesn't continue degradation patterns. So I think understanding the local manifestation of these global patterns is maybe more useful than sort of generalized ecological angst. And I just want to kind of, this is the fast version, and there is this huge shift in the Salish Sea, where we live right now, that was born in European colonization, and that coincided with this birth of industrial culture and fossil fuel extraction. And so for shorthand, I call this the colonial industrial system. It's actually a very complex human, social, ecological development that has sort of penetrated all societies across the globe, including our own minds and how we think about words like adaptation and resilience. So the local version of the story goes like this. First, we damaged and abused and created dependency in the indigenous communities. So in colonial systems everywhere, the important tactic is to make sure everyone becomes dependent on the social system. It's a critical form of control. And so then second, we slaughtered the other ecosystem architects. The beaver had the bad luck of that their bodies were actually fungible assets. And so the beaver went fast. And then third, we destroyed a massive ecological carbon reserve in old growth forests, in part because we were trying to replicate the degraded cultural ecosystems of Europe. So we recreated the degraded systems that which we had become adapted to. And then finally, we began the rapid conversion of wild animal populations like fish, again, into exchangeable resources to maximize concentration of wealth and power. We forced natural riverscapes into ditches, drained the wetland complexes to maximize the production of exchangeable assets. There's kind of a pattern here. And then sixth, as we entered into global wars of competition among different colonial powers, in World War II in particular, we released a wave of heavy metals and petrochemical toxins, building ships, smelting aluminum, all that kind of stuff. Seventh, We expanded our population, we dehydrated the landscape. So that's the wetland conversion, deforestation, ditching and draining. And then we basically increased the speed that rain runs off the land into those rivers. And then eighth, as we desperately develop new technologies to survive in the world we are creating, the Green Revolution and thereafter, we began introducing a wide range of novel, organic, bioactive compounds into the ecosystem with unpredictable effects, from pesticides to flame retardants to plastics to novel petrochemicals to hormones. And then ninth, as a side effect of this project, we have begun to destabilize the global climate system. So as it's important in my mind, as discussed later, not to see climate change as an isolated, unfortunate event and an isolated problem to solve, but something that really defines how we structure our societies, who we are, how we think, and that it makes me nervous to think of climate change as an isolated event, particularly because a lot of the work I do up to date with the extinction of species and attempts to recover ecosystems are just beginning to feel the effects of climate change, and most of the damage has been caused by other processes. So I could go on and on and on about the details of that. That's not why we're here. How I think about local adaptation and resilience is informed by this context. I think it's been really well summarized by Rockstrom and the fellows at the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and the development of the concept of safe operating space for humanity. It's a good series of papers, interesting concepts that are a useful tool for just organizing thinking. And if we can't understand or agree upon sort of the underlying story, our chances of developing a coherent strategy as communities are greatly reduced. So it's hard to play a game if you don't know the rules or you can't see the game board. So time to take a breath. I don't know about you, but every time I go through that story, I have to take a breath and connect with my body, and that story just makes me afraid and weary. And and I suspect, though, that we need to sort of gently hold that whole story if we're going to figure out how to help our people well. And I've often used this quote by the late Billy Frank Jr. Many times in presentations, but actually in preparing for today, I found a version that had this extra sentence that I really liked. And so in the beginning, I don't believe in magic. I believe in the sun and the stars, the water, the tides, the floods, the owls, the hawks flying, the river running, the wind talking. They're measurements. They tell us how healthy things are, how healthy we are, because we and they are the same. That's what I believe in. And then this extra sentence showed up in this particular version. Those who learn to listen to the world that sustains them can hear the message brought forth by the salmon. So that urgency of the world that sustains them, and us trying to make sense of that, which, is it a salmon run? Is it an algae pond? Is it any number of different technologies that we use to create the place we live? And so I'd propose that perhaps our greatest challenge, particularly in local resilience and adaptation, is being able to figure out the right questions. So we are a society full of possible answers and justifications. However, unfortunately, the measurements suggest that we're kind of out of control. And so it makes me nervous about all of our answers, given the measurements to date. So we started with this question: how do we support local resilience and adaptability through federal and state programs? And I add the state in there because federal and state programs are very similar. They both create local operating conditions. And also state and federal programs are typically so interwoven, it's hard to tell them apart. There's a lot of interaction between state and federal authorities, and also the relationships among and between state and federal actors compared to local actors is fairly distinct if you spend time in that space. So I think thinking about state and federal programs as a single thing is actually useful for analysis and planning. So if we're evaluating these programs as a potential tool, we should probably get some kind of grip on what we're talking about. And I'm particularly focused on executive branch agencies here and their ilk. They depend on legislatures, control the money and the law, and then the courts arbitrate the combat among lawyers. But in general, this executive agency system, like Department of Ecology or Department of Transportation, they represent our collective ability to do work. They are the collective workers of society. And so, after 20 years, I now try and make sense of government by sort of focusing on three meta systems that each have functions and that we could work with, and play with as local actors. And the first one, planning and funding, we're pretty familiar with. An institution like Madrona Institute submits an application, they get reviewed. If they win, they get money to do projects, right? So the middle one, regulation and mitigation, is a different kind of system where a private actor needs to ask permission, and then their behavior is regulated, and they're sometimes resulting in compensatory mitigation. So they can do some of what they want. Often those programs, they're kind of poor and understaffed because you make a lot more friends by handing out money than by telling people you can't do stuff. And every program in these agency systems depends on some kind of patronage. Someone has to care enough to keep the program alive, to keep it funded. And so the system of patronage within programs is actually some of the undercurrents of how this system operates. Finally, there's programs that measure stuff. It could be economic activity, ecosystems, traffic, and this information is potentially really useful, especially if you're experimenting or trying to create accountability or control something. But a lot more attention is generally on who gets the money and who gets to do what. And so observation systems are also often fairly weak compared to other government agency activity. And only the information that's gathered is only that which is required or necessary or someone will advocate for. So the other interesting element of government programs is what we call the silos, so siloing. So different agencies and departments within agencies and programs within departments are all trying to stay alive, maintain their patronage, not cross some line, makes too many people angry or too few people happy. And what this means is that government systems, by their nature, are fairly incoherent. They're organized into all these competing units with partial authority and constantly reacting to situations controlled by their legislative environment. They're also fairly resistant to influence because easily influenced government is also known as corruption, right? If you can easily manipulate a government, then everyone's going to go in and try and make government do things. So there is natural resistance. It's difficult to make governments do things, and so then you have to lure them. I often consider it like my chickens, and it's with your chickens escape the yard. It's really hard to chase them back in, but it's much easier to dribble some food and then they follow you right back in the pen. So overall, just because of the structure of the system, based on my experience, I don't believe that it can define or describe or evaluate or design local resilience and adaptation. Resilience and adaptation is an integrated phenomena. And if you're waiting for a Lone Ranger to come over this hill and define or describe or create resilience, I don't think it's going to happen. I think you can find insiders and allies within government, but you will not necessarily find coherence in government. And I think that coherence needs to be constructed locally. So let's dive into that a little bit. So I think it's useful to look at government as part of this game board. However, and in state and federal government is this major piece of social infrastructure, controls the vast majority of our collective resources and sort of sets the rules of play on the playing field. However, you need to try and make sense of that system if you are a local institution that wants to try and access those authorities and resources and bring them into a coherent approach. So one of the challenges, and so in this way, these local general purpose governments, special purpose districts like conservation districts or ports or civil society institutions, Indian nations. They're the local infrastructure, the local governance or social infrastructure that can capture these various resources and use them to actually construct local social ecological systems. So I think the risk is thinking that state and federal agencies and programs are going to solve your problem rather than you figuring out how to entrain those agencies in working with you to solve the problem as you define it. So the other challenge is this incoherence of the state and federal system is contagious. It's sort of socially contagious because each agency and program is operating in its own world. Then local governments might sort of line up with a particular source of funding or a particular source of authority, and then also sort of narrows their world to match the narrow worldview of their state and federal counterpart. So I think there's this potential for local government to become as sort of siloed as state and federal government, but it's not necessarily required. And that's what's so interesting to me about the opportunity of local resilience planning. So local social systems have this opportunity to reintegrate the various goals and objectives of public society. And I propose that that is in fact the only solution to the incoherence of state and federal systems, is this coherence of local vision and leadership. So to have that coherence, I think that local communities need to figure out what the right questions are. And I think there's a lot of different kinds of questions you might ask, and that asking and answering those questions helps form a collective identity. And so I think that is where the opportunity for coherence might live. So resilience and adaptation are not novel to climate change. I think that the specter of climate change is sharpening our senses. I think it's really important to think about our goals in a local community. What are we trying to achieve? What does that mean? How does it fit into our story of ecological collapse or climate change, or changing our carbon trajectory? Which brings me to, I think, a query about the concepts of resilience and adaptation. I think they're interestingly divergent. So resilience, the ability to survive and return to normal after disturbance. So adaptation, by contrast, the process of changing normal over time. So resilience and adaptation could actually be competing strategies. So investing in resilience, being able to recover back to normal, might actually slow down adaptation. So I think a great example is National Flood Insurance Program, which uses a national taxation scheme to subsidize resilience in floodplains. So you get flooded, the government bails you out, and then by doing so, well, we risk slowing adaptation to changing flood hazards under climate change. So some cases, resilience can actually slow adaptation. In a different situation, adaptation could increase resilience, which gives us more resources to adapt in the future. They could work in synergy. So then the resilience to certain kinds of disturbances allow us to continue adapting if we have that system kind of figured out. So I think we need to pay really careful attention to the meanings of these words. The opportunity for self-deception is great. People talk fast. And so I think that there is actually a tremendous need, and I do not see it happening at a state and federal level, to be more careful and clear in defining what kind of resilience are we talking about and what kind of adaptation are we talking about. So let's, and so as we get into this idea of change, like as we try and figure out how to change a local system so that it's adaptive or more resilient in certain cases, or is resulting in reduction of carbon demand, I think we need to really make sense of the kind of animals that we are as human animals. We're really quite extraordinary. I mean, we're right up there with beaver and other ecosystem engineers, that we modify ecosystems to create our own habitats, and in doing so, we affect the habitats of all other creatures. So, and even more interestingly, I think we do this by cultivating specific roles for members of our groups. So we create jobs. So the jobs we create reflect the cultural pattern that's inherited from generation to generation. So that's now how we evolve. Human evolution is through this iteration and transfer of culture intergenerationally. And the culture involves both physical infrastructure, the stuff we think we need to survive, and then also social infrastructure, the jobs and the relationships and the ownership structures that allow us to sustain and maintain that infrastructure. So we inherited that. We inherited that culture and how we do it, from our ancestors, and we also inherited the tragedy of ecological collapse, which is defined by our culture from our ancestors. So, and I'm using kind of a literary or a Shakespearean concept of tragedy here, right? Because the Shakespearean tragedy is where there's this well-intentioned person, but they still fail and suffer because of their inherent failings and weaknesses. And so I'd propose that our challenge here is to take control of cultural evolution in order to be able to shift infrastructure. And this is, I think, interesting and important about how it is that we can actually change local infrastructure over time, and that it may not just be a physical phenomena, but it might also be a cultural phenomena. So the manifestation of how we live is in our infrastructure. We build this infrastructure in a particular, it enables a particular way of life. That way of life is dependent on the infrastructure, so that the two things mesh together. Way of life and infrastructure start reinforcing each other. And it helps to define what our actual infrastructure is, where it comes from, and how that's entangled in culture. So adaptation is change. And when we talk about change, we're talking about some people benefiting and some people losing. And that is a difficult and complex territory. So I'm going to introduce a model of change analysis I think is really useful, which is called three horizons practice. And so in this view of a problem, we make the assumption that all systems change, that over time, many systems become less fit because the context changes. And we can either slow or accelerate that change. And different people can live in the same world and see the same system in different ways. You may think the existing system is great. I may think the existing system is horrible. And so, the people managing the transportation infrastructure may know better than anyone about how it's becoming less fit. However, they have work to do to keep that system running. And letting the system just fail has negative consequences. Usually, they are invested with a strong hold on social and economic power to maintain an existing system. So this red line is the first horizon of three horizons. Is that process of managing and maintaining an existing system even as it becomes less fit. However, some participants see the deep failures of existing systems and see the seeds of the future, recognize that for those seeds to be realized there must be transformation. And so these visionaries are focused on the blue line, which is the third horizon. And then others see opportunities in the weakness of the existing system to find ways to capture resources and create innovation. So that innovation can either prop up the old system, or it can try and propel towards transformation. So innovation can cut either way in terms of reinforcing a historical way of doing things or creating a new way of doing things. So these entrepreneurs are focused on the yellow line, which is the second horizon. And I want to direct our attention to this second horizon, how we discover the linkages, the connections between a failing system and a potential future. And that is a rich territory of politics and innovation, and I think local innovation in particular. So now each of these factions, the first horizon, the second horizon, third horizon, each think that the others are less intelligent or morally corrupt or both. So however, being able to see system change through all three lenses allows us to see opportunities for looking for windows to accelerate constructive change. So there is a literature, small literature on three horizons practice. I found it very useful. I would encourage exploring that at some point in time. So let's look at resilience and adaptation again. So now in government, resilience and adaptation are just, they're slippery words that roll off our tongues. It's become a new marketing language. Agencies, including mine, we repackage programs with resilience and adaptation labels. It's totally an understandable first or even a second horizon strategy to manage the fact that some funding programs become less and less fit because they're not acknowledging the full scope of problems in the landscape. So in some cases, this kind of adaptive behavior in government can lead to, this desired adaptation. In other cases, it's just propping up a system that is functioning less and less well. And so we need to, again, be careful about the use of words like resilience and adaptation and what they mean. And the definitions of those words become very important. So let's look at one particular area of adaptation that seems fundamental to the entwined arc of ecological collapse and climate change, adaptation, and resilience. In this case, water, drought, and fire regimes. We're looking at a range of different influences that have broad effects on ecosystems and occurring over time, baked into existing changes in climate. And so these dynamics are not isolated to climate change. So they operate in synergy with existing hydrologic degradation. So we had lots of water, we dehydrated our watersheds for a variety of purposes, and now we're less prepared for longer dry periods. So this sort of the colonial industrial ecological collapse, that we discussed at the very beginning, the dehydration of watersheds and all the associated development that affects the biodiversity and productivity of those systems, is now working in synergy with climate change. And that in many cases, the resilience that we're looking for is the lost resilience of the system that we degraded through the rapid period of colonial economic development. So water resilience, becomes this efficient ability to capture and store water in ecological systems to sustain all kinds of life. There are lots of different ways to adapt to shorter wet seasons. How do we evaluate those different approaches? What do they do in other aspects of the local community? And ultimately, any water system change will involve coordination of restoration and regulation and observation of hydrologic systems across a range of agencies and departments and authorities. And so there's a unique potential for a local institution to do that work and that weaving and then start causing those agencies to find ways to improve. So an example, one of our largest hydrologic engineering systems in watersheds is our transportation network with impervious surfaces, cross-valley road prisms, ditches, culverts, but the hydration of watersheds is not an objective for transportation agency management, even though they may have tremendous control over water flow at a watershed scale. So transportation shops are also, they're not staffed, they're not structured to think clearly about water management. So here you have this disconnection, which is just inherent in the incoherence of government, but there's no better opportunity to explore and retrofit and prototype that than within the context of a local community or a county, which has its own transportation management system and stormwater management system. So, in each of these cases, we're not talking about generalized adaptation and resilience, but rather a careful shift in the infrastructure of society, both social and physical, to create an adaptive capability. So we're not talking about projects per se, but we're talking about projects as a tool in an evolutionary process. So, what kind of society is capable of adaptation and constructive resilience under stress? Like, what are the attributes of that society? How would we consider and redefine infrastructure? How would we construct new roles, new jobs within a society to enable that work to happen? So Personally, I don't believe that societal collapse is imminent in the Salish Sea, and I expect that those hoping for some clear push down a new path will remain frustrated and disappointed. I expect we will probably also be a climate refuge. Some of our greatest pressures might be mass migration rather than direct, ecological pressures. And social and ecological collapse is happening right now in other places. And the patterns that ecologists have been talking about for generations in terms of other drivers of ecological collapse, including agriculture and a whole number of other elements of our mass infrastructure, they're still present and they're still unchanged. So our ability to reckon what a climate and ecological strategy would look like is, I think, really just beginning to shift. And I like metaphors, so I'm going to go with the lifeboat metaphor. The reason I like metaphors is because I think humans are storied creatures. Like, stories help us make sense of complexity. Telling and retelling stories. How many times have you heard of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? As a metaphor. Telling stories is how we organize our social minds. And the challenge is that stories are powerful, but they can be good powerful or bad powerful. Some stories will undermine our adaptability. Other stories increase our adaptability. So back to the lifeboat metaphor, when a ship is sinking, you have to narrow your focus, right? You don't need to rescue your cufflinks or your ballroom gown. I'm going to kind of go back to Billy Frank and saying, in his words, those who learn to listen to the world that sustains them can hear the message brought forth by the salmon. So listening to the world that sustains them. I think what we need in order to be able to do adaptation at a community scale is some kind of feedback mechanism or some kind of focus that keeps our attention on the deeper challenge rather than on the cultural conditioning of what we think we need, rather focusing on what do we actually need. The reason I'm so interested in water and food systems and the restoration economy together is that I suspect our direct connection to the earth might be that focus. That when we have local communities able to see the presence or absence of sustenance in the land, that becomes very visceral and clear. Food, water, shelter, care in the hands of our neighbor as pressure increases on human societies. Having those potentials firmly in hands, having clear stories can help us stay focused on that work. In the lifeboat, we need the creative engagement and participation of everyone on the boat. There can be neither troublemakers nor freeloaders on a lifeboat. So what do we need to build lifeboats? Like 6 years ago, I had the chance to interview around 60 restoration practitioners across Puget Sound about what they needed to do ecological restoration. And all of those interviews converged on just 6 ingredients. If you had all 6 ingredients, you could do just about anything you wanted to. If you're missing one, you were going to struggle. And lacking 2, you would likely fail. So, however, these ingredients interact, right? Cash flow can be used to retain skilled people, and social consensus can lead to land access. So it's this complex system of shifting and interacting resources, maybe different forms of social capital, you could call it all kinds of stuff, that then feed into one another. And, do we have the appropriate people in roles to create and hold stories over the time? Some of these might be elected people, some of them might be hired people. What new jobs, would we envision? A government is one of the few places where you can simply create a job in order to provide a public benefit. How does this relate to feedback loops or accountability systems that would help strengthen our stories and clarify our understandings? The role of shared vision or social consent is incredibly important in a private property society. So if the will of people becomes coordinated, then all kinds of possibilities open up that are just beyond our current imagination. Private property can cause a kind of hoarding. Land base has so many potential values. So having social infrastructure that allows us to share the land and make the best and highest use of land, It's a very complex and interesting challenge, so that we can use the land base in the most productive way for the benefit of all the members of the lifeboat. So finally, the goal of state and federal funding might be to buy new pieces of systems, but it might also just to create the conditions necessary for retrofit, for evolution. So money by itself, you can spend it and it's gone next year and then you're done. But for money to be valuable, we need to figure out how to convert it into other forms of durable capital, so that our temporary gluts of money, like right now, what's happening with the bipartisan infrastructure law, it may well burn out, and we may get a bump afterwards, but it's not going to be like the salad days right now. So as we pass money through these systems, as we bring cash into or projects into a local community, how are we using that cash also to build local capital? What kinds of local capital are we trying to build, and how do we use the flow of money to engender that production? So just to try and wrap up, I hope you can see federal and state resources are a useful tool. They represent a tremendous amount of social capital. They're fairly incoherent in how they're organized. And they also depend, I think, in my mind, entirely on a coherent local strategy. I think that money can be spent in a way that achieves lots of different benefits. And it could also be spent in a way that builds community capital. But if it's just sort of dumped into self-absorbed silos to complete work, just to keep the institution alive, it may not really be working in a constructive way as a second horizon activity that's shifting us towards some kind of transformative process. So I wanted to close with a few ideas about strategy. These are all this is my current library of second horizon tactics, and I want to keep working and thinking and playing with these and come up with good examples and good models that I've seen out there in the world. Let's dive right in. One is network functions. So I see a tremendous amount of growth and development where we have less institutional positioning and more collaboration and experimentation. There is a natural tendency to sort of focus on your institution and promoting your institution compared to, and there's a lot of incentives to do that too. However, to develop collective stories requires more of these network functions of building teams, and this communication is a critical part of team play. And it may not be communications at the top of an institution. It might be communications among staff across institutions. And it's sort of the lifeblood of a network function is this continuous multi-directional exchange of information. It's not my network, it's not your network, but rather it's creating a new circumstance that we can try to leverage. In many ways, universities and NGOs can become very self-interested rather than serving as true network nodes. How would you retrofit? How would you use resources to carefully retrofit to build information and network infrastructure within your community and leveraging existing institutions that are already there in ways that they may not even realize that they could be leveraged? So next is to focus on big stories. Help governments understand the large cross-cutting stories of communities and places, create this vision of local coherence so that it's embarrassing to not be able to keep up. If an agency program wants to look good and relevant, and if they are unable to meet the needs of an innovation that everyone's really excited about, then that can really engender change. That's the chicken feed and luring the chickens into the coop by putting a trail of food. So use big local story prototypes and then reverse engineer government using those prototypes. As a colonial society glutted in fossil fuels, and our ever-expanding bureaucracies, we have a lot of inefficiency. In fact, we've been able to tolerate huge inefficiency. In fact, sort of our rate of carbon burning is a testimony to massive inefficiency and incoherence in how we're using limited resources. So the very definition of adaptation is to achieve more value using fewer resources, particularly carbon. And so this is a situation that's like born for value engineering or lean management or Kaizen Gemba, which are established philosophies that are developed inside the manufacturing industry. So I think improvement processes and accountability strategies can really cut at the guts of bureaucratic thinking and start to identify what's the value. And especially when the local community can define that value and then create accountability around creating that value. So first horizon managers, folks that are just trying to maintain existing systems, they already see this coming. They're already trying to pose as efficiency advocates. However, they're not necessarily exposing themselves to external criticism in defining efficiency. So I think there's a huge opportunity to talk about value creation and efficiency as from the local perspective, as a mechanism for putting pressure on state and federal systems. Finally, I would resist thinking of money as just an essential fuel. I think that you can use money to create all kinds of sort of events and effects. Like an example, Senator Cantwell's staff, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, gave federal highways a tremendous pile of money to repair fish passage, right? But federal highways, they didn't even know what fish passage barriers were, but then suddenly they had to look good in front of the legislature. And so what Cantwell's staff did is they created an incentive for federal highways to rapidly start thinking about fish passage and incorporating that into their programming, because now they have the pressure to spend this money. So in that case, money created social niches, it created motive, it created opportunities for cross-pollination between agencies that already have fish passage programs and federal highways. So all first horizon actors, people trying to maintain existing systems, are hungry for money to survive. And money can always have strings attached. And how you use money to create experiences can really change, I think, how systems operate, and particularly in local contexts where you have a prototype or it can show that you're creating more value for less resources. So finally, I would propose that that reality is largely place-based. Like how we actually live, how we actually sustain ourselves is defined in the place. You wake up in the morning, the building you live in, the food you eat, where you go and how far you have to go to do what you need to do. All of that is that's the guts of a society, and whether a society is survives or is sustainable or is regenerative or fails completely. So what we do, if it's successful or not, we'll see it on the ground. So I often look to on the ground change as my metric for whether I believe something is worth doing. And there's a lot of need for experiments. Don't believe everything you think is a good idea when you start. But I think that the reason why I focus on this on the ground thinking is that we are at a high risk of fooling ourselves, right? Because we're coming from a culture that has lived a failed story for so long, it's hard to know where our thinking is just going to repeat the same kinds of problems we've created in the past. Back to Billy Frank's words, right? Those who learn to listen to the world that sustains them, they can hear the message brought forth by the salmon, right? So the measure of what we're doing is right in front of us. And this inescapable reality of what's right in front of us is built of these culturally constructed niches that are our evolutionary vehicle. So I would suggest three concepts. One is that there's going to be places that I call strongholds that will be able to create redesigned social physical infrastructure. It's going to take a lot of work and it's going to be experimental, and they're going to lead the practical work. Those places that are able to organize their local governments into a coherent strategy to start rebuilding and experimenting with that social and physical infrastructure. Those strongholds are then going to be in a position to mobilize and support each other and support new strongholds in getting up to speed. So you need the prototypes, and it's easier to transfer ideas from one local government to another if someone else has tried it and showed success. So strongholds, I used to call this for the second phenomena, field stations, that you find a place where you can test and experiment. And then finally, I would say that through this process of building strongholds, stepping into field station locations, that we're going to need to be able to exchange knowledge and develop an open knowledge network to be able to rapidly transfer information from place to place. I think universities have a tremendous role to play in this regard, and yet I don't think they necessarily have fulfilled that function for civil society or for local government. There's often a separation from academic institutions and local teams, and I'd love to figure that out as well. So I think that's kind of, I want to wrap up there. Thank you and welcome to the greatest strategy game of all time. This is the game into which we try to plug state and federal agency resources. I think there will be allies, but the programs, they're always going to lag behind. And then they're going to change to try and catch up. And so I think the dangerous strategy is to allow the relic infrastructure, and that's a lot of what I think our government institutions represent, a relic infrastructure of colonial industrial systems, to define our local work. I think it's really the job of local work to define a way of living, figure out the infrastructure, learning amongst each other and themselves, what's the infrastructure system that works in that place with that ecosystem in its current condition, and then use the state and the federal system to test and experiment in that way. And I think that reframing it that way will give you a lot more leverage in trying to figure out how to interact with these agencies that are really essentially looking to local communities, governments, and institutions to define the words that they pass around so quickly. That was definitely more than 40 minutes. Thank you guys for letting me go on.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I am so grateful to everybody for our at-home audience and our folks at the labs. Hopefully, friends who are on Zoom, you've been able to eat your dinner and go to the restroom and pulse in and out as our virtual speaker series can allow you to do. And Paul and Chuck, this was absolutely phenomenal. I know there were several questions, but what I want to do first is give everyone permission to log off. I know screen time is exhausting for people. So if you need to log off and then watch the recording of the Q&A, you're welcome to do that and just skip to the end or rewatch it because so much of this information was so vital. And let me just do 2 quick announcements for people who want to log off and get rolling, and then we'll come back to some Q&A. But I just want to name that this is the second in a 4-part speaker series. So October 12th and October 26th will be 2 more installations. We'll be getting down to those brass tacks that Paul just really so articulately enunciated around local strategies and local resilience. We'll be talking about energy in our local context next speaker series. And then in the last one, I feel like you just queued it up so perfectly for us, Paul, about networks and about cross-pollination of local networks and increasing our impact and resilience. And so that'll be a networking session with lightning talks with local organizations here in the San Juans. And how do we be in those conversations that builds those kinds of cross-lateral resilience, right? Resilient structures that make us stronger together. So in our local ecosystem. So that'll be on the 26th. With that said, if you need to sign off, thank you so much. I'd like to direct now, we have a couple questions in the chat, and Chuck, I'm hoping you can come back online here. If you have a question for Paul, please feel free to put it in the chat. There's certainly a lot of thanks and a lot of folks who are going to rewatch things, which is great. But Chuck, there was some really specific questions. I hope you can hear me. Amy had a question about the maximum time you're able to culture algae in the open raceways and wanted to know what are the major contaminants that you find when there are issues with contamination. So Chuck, I don't know if you can answer that one.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so, initially what we were doing is growing the algae out in those open raceway ponds for 2 days and then letting them deplete all of the nutrients for the third day and then harvesting. Because if they deplete all the nutrients, it turns out that they convert their a lot more. They have a much higher protein content, but we found out that it was actually better to harvest them with a lower protein content after 2 days, because the rate of protein production, by adding that extra third day, ended up depleting the amount of protein you're producing per day. So that's a long way of saying we sort of optimize the number of days that we do before harvesting. The things that can contaminate can be other algae. It can be protozoans. Some of these protozoan grazers grow even faster than the algae. So that's why it's critical to put in a very high concentration inoculum to start them out, and then just grow them out for a couple of days before the contaminants catch up with them.
Great. I see a thank you from Amy in the chat window. So Chuck, thank you for that one. And then there was one question from Jay, who wanted to know, what would the price per hectare be? And what is the major contributor to the total cost?
Yeah, so that of course depends on where in the world you're doing it. And like I pointed out, we're not going to be doing this in the Pacific Northwest. And we're probably not going to be doing it in the United States, except for possibly Puerto Rico would be a good place to do it. I see the real opportunities being in the global South. Land and labor is relatively inexpensive. It also potentially, provides employment in places that need it. So, I think I really liked thinking about the content that I was providing in or thinking about what Paul was talking about in the context of what I'm talking about, because, we as scientists and as technologists, we kind of try to figure out what the possible is, and then you have to figure out how you're going to implement it, right? And that's what Paul's talk was all about. So it was really valuable for me to think about all of those issues that he raised, which would be critical to these things. So, you can't grow algae in places where land is expensive. And in the Western world, if you're close to the ocean, the land gets more expensive. If you're close to major areas where there are large populations, again, it often gets more expensive. So, it's a very different way of thinking about things. And, some parts of the world are going to be much more receptive to incorporating algae into their diet than others. At least in our culture, I sort of see the microalgae kind of inheriting the plant-based meat substitutes that we see, with the Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat, and recognizing that they currently use soy and pea, and if we used algae, those products could be even more nutritious.
Absolutely. It is so exciting. Chuck, I feel like you and Paul have two amazing and distinct presentations that I just found myself leaning in closer and closer. And I see a lot of that reflected in the chat window. A lot of people saying, thank you so much. Really brilliant. Thank you for your work. Chuck, it looks like there is an ask about how to best connect with you, whether that might be LinkedIn, or if you might add your email, or the best way for folks to contact you and stay in touch with you. If you have that, you can add it into the chat window. And I'm going to take us on home tonight, because we're almost at the 2-hour mark, which is astonishing for Zoom. But I think it really speaks to both of the brilliance and the innovations and the storytelling that you both brought to us tonight. I'm so, so grateful for it. The last thing I want to say is, in addition to a huge thank you, is that the Madrona Institute also has a beautiful license plate campaign that has a Madrona tree on it, as well as images of the San Juan Islands, and that a lot of all those proceeds that go for that special license plate, not just for vanity or a sense of place, but they really go into conservation. They go into special funding grants that are donated and given to applicants. That the application period is open right now for local grants. And I think it really feeds into the local kinds of resilience and ways that we can collaborate with one another and help both impact and support and fund each other's work, as Paul really beautifully talked about. So I just wanted to name that, and Kelsey can say more about that, I'm sure, in the chat about the special license plate campaign and the funding window. But Chuck, was there anything you wanted to say in closing here?
I have a couple of people that have questions here. So what I would say is everybody that is in another place, if they're ready to go, they should go. And we can just leave the Zoom open and I can answer these questions, and anybody that wants to stick around
sure thing.
for them can. Okay?
Sure thing.
Okay. Craig.
Thank you. Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. And one of the challenges with all these ideas is scaling them up to have a significant effect. And given the fact that more than 50% of the global population lives within 100 kilometers of the coastline, and what have you done the calculations to figure out what percentage of the coastal terrestrial zone would be required to be occupied by these kinds of farms to make it an impact? I think many gigatons scale.
Yeah, gigatons of protein. Oh, right. So the question basically was, have we figured out how much coastal land is actually available globally to do this? And one of the interesting things is that because we don't need arable land, we can do it in coastal deserts. So there are large areas of coastal deserts that are ideal in the Middle East, Saharan North Africa, Baja California, Mexico. And so I think that there's quite a bit of land that's available. We were just, and actually, when you start to think about it, even if you go, for example, to California. Now, California is a little bit too far north for us to do it. But even if you look at a state like California, we think about Los Angeles, we think about San Francisco, we think about the big cities. But if you look along most of the coast, there's actually a lot of unoccupied land, even in the US. So I think, I can't tell you, I can't give you percentages, but we can have a major impact, I think, on providing nutrition in the world. And I don't think everybody's ready to go out and eat algae, but what we're basically, again, doing is looking at the way to produce protein powders that then get introduced into things that, at least in the West, we're more used to eating. When people, sometimes I get the response, well, do you really think people are going to kind of give up their steaks to eat algae? And I was like, well, that's a very Western perspective, and there's probably 80% of the people in the world that actually really need to find alternative sources of protein. They're not the people that are being asked to trade off their steaks, right? So, again, I think it's a major opportunity, and I think that if we really need to reduce the carbon, land, and freshwater footprint of agriculture, and so we need to sort of think outside the box. And this is about as outside the box as you can get. Gretchen.
I'm wondering about the palatability of the products, and do the cows like it? And then can it be produced in forms where people can, will want to eat?
Yeah, so the question is palatability to both animals and to humans. And, that was one of the things that had been holding things back, but food science has made tremendous advances so that now you can get things to look, taste, have the texture and the odor that you're looking for. I mean, if you've ever eaten an Impossible Burger, most of that is soy-based, right? Now they've done some other things. I mean, the other question people will have is, well, this is a processed food, and we're so used to the idea that, well, we should be eating whole foods. Well, okay, there's always trade-offs that need to be made. I'm currently working with people that are developing algae-based seafood substitutes, algae-based dairy substitutes. Dairy has a huge impact on the environment. So we're producing yogurts and cheeses and milk substitutes. And one of my former students was working for Impossible Foods, and we got in a conversation with them, and one of the, I was saying, well, this is an incredibly more nutritious source as a meat substitute than the soy that you're currently using. He says, well, for us, the critical thing is, does it pass the Yelp test? And the Yelp test is when people taste it, are they going to say something? Are they going to give you a good review or a bad review? So, that's what the food scientists do, is they figure out how to get the good Yelp reviews. All we can do is kind of figure out what the environmental advantages are, figure out the most efficient, cost-effective, and environmentally friendly ways to produce it, and then rely on the food scientists to help us make it taste good. Yeah.
I was just going to comment that culturally we've been, and I'm not sure where it's at this point, but most of us have grown up with spirulina as a nutrition additive of super blue green algae, and now you can buy dried kelp and all sorts of products that entered our cultural diet. So it can evolve. We all tend to eat sushi, like curry and stuff like that. My question was, did you follow the hydrogen production from late 70s that was being researched in algae and algae production? I don't know if anything ever came of that, or if that's something that can be worked into the food production.
So there are two issues that was just raised. One was sort of about spirulina and other sort of algae foods or nutraceuticals that have been available and have been sort of adopted by at least some people in our society. So algae, it's kind of interesting. Culturally, Asia, they're totally on board. Algae now makes up as much of the aquaculture sector as all of the aquaculture sector 20 years ago. And most of that's happening in China. And China accounts for a vast majority of the aquaculture sector already. So there are parts of the world where consuming algae is just accepted. That's just already the way we do things. I'm actually reading a book now about bluefin tuna and realizing, it is something that people view as a delicacy and are willing to pay tremendous amounts of money for. And 70 years ago, nobody wanted bluefin tuna. So, our tastes can change. It's a matter of making it happen. Now, there was another question you had about hydrogen, and I'm not familiar with that, so I can't really answer it. But afterwards, we can talk about it.
Just for our recording, I just wanted to name a huge thank you to Paul, who I've already said if he needed to sign off, that didn't seem like there were questions for Paul. So just for our posterity, thanks so much, Paul, for all your amazing work. And Chuck, maybe let's do one last question, or if that's the last of the questions, we can wrap up. And
yeah, we can wrap. It's a wrap.
Great. Again, thank you all. I feel like this was a mega marathon Zoom speaker series, but the content was just astonishing. And I'm so grateful to your many decades of work, Chuck, and the expertise that you bring and the conversation that you bring, and also the excitement around, solutions that are coming forward. So I look forward to seeing you all again at our third and hopefully fourth installation of our Climate Action Speaker Series. I thank you all again for your marathon endurance tonight, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Chuck.